So this week we're talking about metaphors and body language, um, and the priority of metaphors and body language in our experience, the unacknowledged priority of metaphors and body language. Um, that, as McGilchrist argues, that as it's commonly acknowledged, that 90% of communication is nonverbal. So, and yet we take linguistic explanations in language, as defining reality. Um, so, a big part of what McGilchrist is inquiring into is this gap that we have an idea in our heads of what's true, which demands a kind of verbal explanation in language, a kind of almost like testimony that you would give in court. I think the court metaphor is apt. That's the final, way in which we arbitrate what really happens is by testimony, adjudicating the testimony of different people, negotiating through language. Um, the truth is written, is what can be sort of recorded. Um, but what we've been exploring in class is how, what we will be exploring, we're kind of getting the basic theoretical terms in place um, for inquiring into what adventure nonfiction prose is about. Um, uh, so, what most experience goes unrecorded, unacknowledged. What most communication is about goes unacknowledged. Um, we want to reduce things um, to knowledge, what we know objectively and rationally. We want to reduce things to what McGilchrist calls an I-it relationship. Um, we want the kind of schematic, explicit, um, overt explanation of reality that language can codify. Uh, Representation in language gives us a fixed explanation of what reality is. But what that leaves out, crucially, the idea of been trying to probe so far in this class um, is these kinds of objective, explicit verbalization, testimony, um, leave out what makes life worth living. That is, what the familiar experience of life, the experience of um, relationships, personal sense of purpose, what McGilchrist calls an I-thou relationship. What it means to live in a human world, what it means to live in within the conversation of human history, human society, is eliminated in the objective picture that we often take for truth. Um, and so, in the passage that I asked you to read for today, the McGilchrist explores asks us to think about how the role of music, in particular, in communication, in our own development, Um, Music plays a real key role in our earliest forms of communication with our parents, even with our mother's body. This is where we initially find our sense of home and belonging and purpose and desire in the world, is in this relationship with our mother's body. Um, I talked earlier about how music um, perhaps developed as an extension of direct bodily interaction, personal grooming, the grooming by a mother of a child, or family members of each other. Um, in a tribal small family unit, um, when human society grew beyond the parameters of such a small uh, group of interactive individuals, music um, replaced that direct bodily interaction. And so, what's really key to bear in mind about music, sound in general, is in distinction to sight, to vision, sound is an inherently interactive um, uh, kind of experience. It's an experience of a relationship. To receive a transmission of sound, to hear sound, is to feel it, just like to receive the experience of touch is to interact with it. Our eardrums vibrate, our whole bodies vibrate to the experience of sound. So um, it literally is a kind of bodily interaction, a coordination um, of bodies, harmonization, attunement, to use the title of a Zadie Smith's um, essay that we're going to read later. Um, Putting bodies in attunement, um, and McGilchrist emphasizes the amount of brain power and evolutionary development behind the capacity for musical communication and communication in general. There's a general environmental outlook that is at stake in this idea, um, that in this distinction between an I-it relationship and an I-thou relationship. Is our capacity to communicate, is an organism's capacity to communicate um, best considered as a property of an individual organism? Um, that is, I think we tend, in our bias towards seeing things in terms of an I-it relationship, we tend to think mating displays, the ornamentation of a animal's um, uh, exterior appearance. Um, these are assets, attributes of individuals that serve their reproduction. Um, so an organism uses its display, its capacity for communication, to serve its individual sense of purpose. Um, but it's possible, and on McGilchrist's view, um, I think the idea of an I-thou relationship turns this equation on its head, prioritizes the relationship. The individual exists for the sake of communicating. It's not that the communication exists for the sake of perpetuating the individual's genes, but the individual's genes exist for the sake of perpetuating the interaction. There is no individual without the context, the interaction. Um, so this um, there's a lot at stake in terms of w- um, what's called an ontological um, perspective. What we count as real? Do we count individuals, pieces, the organisms, pieces of the world? First, that's what's reality, and these relationships are things that individuals do, or is it first of all an environment that we find ourselves in, and we define ourselves in the context of our relationships and surroundings, um, and the kind of basic point that McGilchrist is making is there's no individuals without an environment, without a context and relationships. We are a function of the relationships in which we find ourselves. There is no us without our interaction. We find ourselves, I mean, going back to the idea of our individual development from the way in which we're raised, weaned as babies, um, we discover ourselves. We wake up to ourselves, to the capacity to say I, to speak, and we're already there. We're already immersed in an emotional relationship with our family, and physical relationship in our surroundings. Um, so these are the kind of issues that McGilchrist is drawing our attention to, and that I want to explore in adventure writing. That this adventure writing is about questioning the limits of social norms, exploring a larger world, and trying to expand, our horizons in the most basic way. Um, uh, McGilchrist talks about two different ways, two different meanings that are included within the single English verb to know, that are two different meanings that are distinguished by distinct words in other language, such as the French distinction between connaître and savoir, and the German distinction between kennen and wissen. And these words, connaître and kennen, both suggest family relationships. Kin and conatal, being born together, intertwined, um, uh, versus the objective I-it relationship that's our most commonly used sense of to know, and commonly valorized sense of to know. But McGilchrist is asking you to think about the I-thou aspect, ways in which you know a friend, which you know a song. How is that different than objective knowledge? One thing I always find interesting is, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to look at this, but the uniqueness of every, relationship. Especially when you lose someone, a family member, I think you're really struck, someone close, you're really struck by the absolute uniqueness, irreplaceability of each individual person. And to put it in more mundane ways, I always find it a little odd to think about famous songs or favorite songs, pieces of music that you really love, to think that they didn't exist at one point and somebody just, created them. Um, I feel like there's something. It's difficult in a way to imagine music that you really love not existing. Um, uh, I think these are examples of how um, our, we are embedded in our relationships. And, you know, I, to go to the example again of a loved one who's passed, I think it's often people are very struck by the fact that when a loved one dies, they don't your sense of a relation to them doesn't go away, um, and that again raises a question of ontology. What counts as existing? Um, and in our objective world, we kind of only want to have a very limited sense of what uh, counts as real, what's empirically measurable, um, as present in the world. We can register it with our and record it objectively. But that doesn't do justice, I think, to the psychological reality the phenomenological reality that we live. Um, is embedded with relationships that um, are not reducible to I-it relationships. Um, think about another maybe helpful example: dogs. So our sense of sight, we prioritize our sense of sight, which I think is embedded in a kind of separation, our distance to the world. We see what's apart from us. We uh, um, as opposed to, and I think this is really goes very deep to uh, our sense of ourselves in distinction to other animals which crawl on the earth. We stand apart and survey things at a distance, whereas the animals are sort of defined by their implication in the body and attachment to the earth. Um, and So we valorize what we see as true, and we're troubled in a way by the intimacy of smelling and hearing, the way in which these kind of invade our bodily boundaries. You smell something too strong, or hear something it transgresses a kind of boundary. Um, but think about dogs whose primary sense is smell, um, and it's just one sense rather than another. It's not like one is necessarily more true than another, but um, if smell is your primary sense, then you smell things that aren't there anymore. Like you smell the trace of things that have left, that were there and are gone. Whereas we only see what's there right at this moment. Dogs' perception of reality based in smell it isn't limited to what's there right now, which is all that we see. It includes a broader, an extended period of time, things that have passed through and are no longer there, or that may be approaching in the future, will give a kind of smell. Um, so, what do we mean by let's try to flesh out this idea of body language. Um, what the 90% of communication actually is. Um, Here's Amy Cuddy, who wrote a bestseller called Presence, about the power of body language. Um, she talks about how body language, our body language has the power not just to affect how other people perceive us, but how we perceive ourselves. That is, that our minds follow our bodies in a important way that reverses our normal sense of like our minds control our bodies. Let's listen to a little bit of her TED Talk.
Todorov at Princeton has shown us that judgments of political candidates' faces in just 1 second predict 70% of US Senate and gubernatorial race outcomes. And even, let's go digital, emoticons used well in online negotiations can lead you to claim more value from that negotiation. If you use them poorly, bad idea, right? So when we think of nonverbals, we think of how we judge others, how they judge us, and what the outcomes are. We tend to forget, though, the other audience that's influenced by our nonverbals, and that's ourselves. We are also influenced by our nonverbals, our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology. So what nonverbals am I talking about? I'm a social psychologist, I study prejudice, and I teach at a competitive business school. So it was inevitable that I would become interested in power dynamics. I became especially interested in nonverbal expressions of power and dominance. And what are nonverbal expressions of power and dominance? Well, this is what they are. So in the animal kingdom, they are about expanding. So you make yourself big, you stretch out, you take up space, you're basically opening up. It's about opening up. And this is true across the animal kingdom. It's not just limited to primates, and humans do the same thing. So they do this both when they have power sort of chronically, and also when they're feeling powerful in the moment. And this one is especially interesting because it really shows us how universal and old these expressions of power are. This expression, which is known as pride, Jessica Tracy has studied, she shows that people who are born with sight and people who are congenitally blind do this when they win at a physical competition. So when they cross the finish line and they've won, it doesn't matter if they've never seen anyone do it, they do this. So the arms up in the V, the chin is slightly lifted. What do we do when we feel powerless? We do exactly the opposite. We close up, we wrap ourselves up, we make ourselves small. We don't want to bump into the person next to us. So again, both animals and humans do the same thing. And this is what happens when you put together high and low power. So what we tend to do when it comes to power is that we complement the other's nonverbals. So if someone's being really powerful with us, we tend to make ourselves smaller. We don't mirror them, we do the opposite of them. So I'm watching this behavior in the classroom, and what do I notice? I notice that MBA students really exhibit the full range of power nonverbals. So you have people who are like caricatures of alphas, like really coming into the room, they get right into the middle of the room before class even starts, like they really want to occupy space. When they sit down, they're sort of spread out, they raise their hands like this. You have other people who are virtually collapsing when they come in. As soon as they come in, you see it. You see it on their faces and their bodies, and they sit in their chair and they make themselves tiny, and they go like this when they raise their hand. I noticed a couple things about this. One, you're not going to be surprised. It seems to be related to gender. So women are much more likely to do this kind of thing than men. Women feel chronically less powerful than men, so this is not surprising. But the other thing I noticed is that it also seemed to be related to the extent to which the students were participating and how well they were participating. And this is really important in the MBA classroom because participation counts for half the grade. So business schools have been struggling with this gender grade gap. You get these equally qualified women and men coming in, and then you get these differences in grades, and it seems to be partly attributable to participation. So I started to wonder, okay, so you have these people coming in like this and they're participating. Is it possible that we could get people to fake it, and would it lead them to participate more? So my main collaborator, Dana Carney, who's at Berkeley, and I really wanted to know, can you fake it till you make it? Like, can you do this just for a little while and actually experience a behavioral outcome that makes you seem more powerful? So we know that our nonverbals govern how other people think and feel about us. There's a lot of evidence, but our question really was, do our nonverbals govern how we think and feel about ourselves? There's some evidence that they do. So, for example, when we smile when we feel happy, but also when we're forced to smile by holding a pen in our teeth like this, it makes us feel happy. So it goes both ways. When it comes to power, it also goes both ways. So when you feel powerful, you're more likely to do this. But it's also possible that when you pretend to be powerful, you are more likely to actually feel powerful. So the second question really was, so we know that our minds change our bodies, but is it also true that our bodies change our minds? And when I say minds, in the case of the powerful, what am I talking about? So I'm talking about thoughts and feelings and the sort of physiological things that make up our thoughts and feelings. And in my case, that's hormones. I look at hormones. Powerful versus the powerless.
This relationship among thoughts, feelings or emotions, and behavior is studied. If any of you are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, that's most successful form of psychotherapy, and commonly used form of psychotherapy, which has really sort of replaced the idea of like that in order to fix dysfunctional behavior, you need to change your thinking and sort of figure out your problems. The cognitive behavioral therapy just as Cuddy is saying, turns that around to say, what you need to do is focus on your behavior. Just who cares what you're thinking? Just do things differently, and then your thinking and your feelings will change as a consequence of your acting differently. Your behavior will change your feelings and your thinking and your sense of yourself, just as she's suggesting. How is that different from what we normally talk about as knowledge? What's at stake in body language? What are the different ways of thinking about it? Being in the present, what's happening now, that's really key. That we're so often, thinking about the past, thinking about what happened, earlier today or this week or whenever, or in the future, what's going to happen, and that we lose sight of the present, what's happening now, and so that, again, to use a psychotherapeutical term, mindfulness, being aware, mindful of what's happening now, the present, what's new, versus what is replicable, what's on routine, repeated patterns of experience. That's what's we know what's familiar. Another way, again, the idea of the I-thou relationship. My relationship with my intimate friends or my family is unique to me. Like, it's I can't, like, my relationships with them, it's a unique thing between that I have with them, and that will bear some overlap with their relationship with other people and my relationship with other people, but there's a real uniqueness to it's like my experience of now. It's also the same as my experience of all my relationships and surroundings. So the uniqueness of my experience um, can't be fixed. That's what's kind of paradoxical about it. And what makes it implicit and nonverbal. It can't be held fast in language. It's always fluid. The present is always happening. This is, I think, key idea of adventure. The unpredictability, open-endedness. There's no formula for it. But that's also what makes it paradoxical. It's something that you have to experience. If you have to ask, you'll never know. Um, uh, that's some I want you to be attentive to and thinking about. The that adventure writing is trying to communicate to the reader what it can't say, what it can't fix. Um, so again, back to Alison Gopnik's distinction between exploitation of what we know, confirmation bias of adults tend to look in the world for what confirms what they already know. That's confirmation bias is a real thing among adults, and also loss aversion. We cling to what we have, what we know, and are averse to what threatens that. Versus the exploration bias of children. Children actively want to actively seek out what surprises them, and disrupts what they expect. Language is the contagiousness of language. Think if you've ever lived among people with a different accent, the way you unconsciously, adopt, imitate. That's a big part of what's going on with language communication. Is again like that ontological reversal, prioritizing relationships over individuals serve relationships rather than relationships serving individuals. We talk in order we exchange information not in order to exchange information, but in order to the bonding that goes on with talking. And that's really evident, I think, in the way in which we adapt to each other's way of speaking. The contagiousness of speech is, reminiscent of the way in which we learn speech from our parents in the first place. Here's a kind of funny example. The contagiousness of language.
You'll see kids out there again
Some
today.
of those kids today will be my co-hosts.
It's just like, dude, you get the best barrels ever, dude. Just like you pull in and you just get spit right out of them. And you just drop in and just smack the lip. Whoop-ah! Drop down, snap, and then after that, you just drop in, just ride the barrel and get pitted, so pitted like that.
Well, actually, you know what? I take.
Whether or not you find that contagious, I hope you get the point that so much of communication is about sharing emotion, weaving different emotional attitudes together. So I want to think about that, or McGilchrist asks us to think about that in terms of the distinction between music, poetry, metaphor, versus proper literal language. So this is like implicit meaning, less than explicit. You can't. It is never totally spelled out what it means. means what it does, especially music, uh, only by being implicit. You have to experience music. You have to, like a dance, what the dance means is just the experience of going through it. You have to kind of participate in the song in order to receive the communication. If you spell it out, what it means, translate it into some static explanation, that denatures it. Again, it translates it into a different ontology, mode of reality. So this and that's what makes music effective at communicating about emotion, because emotion likewise is an experience of movement, of being a compulsion of the body, of relationship, of being situated in emotional predicaments. Music involves us similarly in a kind of movement, puts us in an experience of now, takes us on a adventure of various movements, various kinds of emotion. Here's another example I find fun. Of the difference between sort of poetic meaning of language and the literal meaning of language.
Any alcohol, drugs, sex after 12, or any other illegal activity.
Not my shadow.
Later, baby. Found that in the glove compartment, man.
Hey, you know you're the third person who's given me this today? God.
But what do you reckon you're gonna do?
I don't know, man. I'll probably end up signing it. I just don't want to give in so easy.
Man, it's the same bullshit they tried to pull in my day. You know, if it ain't that piece of paper, some other choice they're gonna try and make for you. You gotta do what Randall Pink Floyd wants to do, man. Let me tell you this. The older you do get, the more rules are gonna try to get you to follow. You just gotta keep living, man. Livin. Man.
So I think that's fun, but also instructive to think about. What's the difference between living? You got to keep on living, like, there's literal meaning to that, which is kind of obvious. Like, you have to stay alive. But what is it? You got to keep on living. Livin. What does that mean? You have to sort of play it out for yourself. He's communicating emotion, investment, what it means to be you. You got to do what you want to do. You got to do you. Like, what does that mean? What it means is has to do with its unknowability, that it can't be fixed, that it's up to you to fill this open, ambiguous feeling of selfhood. So I'm trying to talk. It's funny how difficult it is to talk about this, how unusual it is to try to talk about what these meanings that go unsaid, because I think they're really so important to us. McGilchrist, this is McGilchrist's argument that metaphors, like this idea of living, like a poetic communication, that's the cause of our behavior and it's the effect of our behavior. What we say, how we explain ourselves is rationalization, alibis, what we do in the meantime, as John Lennon said, like Life is what happens when we're making other plans. We're thinking about what we're doing, coming up with all these plans, rationalizations, explanations of ourselves. But what we're really, the real feeling of life, experience of life, is responding to each other in these rather musical, poetic ways.